Today we have some fun. We look at the national demasking on trains, planes, and automobiles. We'll look at the logic behind the ruling next. Hey, welcome back to the Farah Show. Today we look at the demasking of trains, planes, and automobiles. It's a win for freedom and logic. You know, whether you travel or not, you've no doubt heard that the mask mandate has been quashed by a federal judge in the Tampa district. The White House said the ruling was disappointing. The Justice Department said they'll appeal. Passengers from Spain to Atlanta heard the announcement in mid-flight and they whistled with loud, spontaneous applause. Flight attendants were euphoric. The left-wing media accused the judge of misapplying the law. The New York Post says that the left's attacks show that they are in fact the ones who are ignorant and do not understand the law. Now, if the Department of Justice really does follow through with an appeal, will it hold up? Well, I don't think so. Let's have some fun. What I'm going to do is just go through the judge's 59-page ruling and collapse it to 6. I'm going to paraphrase some things, but I'm going to try to stay true to what the judge actually said. You can decide for yourself, but I think it's pretty clear on 4 counts that the judge ruled in accordance with the law, and thank God. So Judge Kathryn Mizel is a young federal judge. She serves as United States District Judge in the Tampa District. She ruled that the mask mandate was not lawful. Judge Mizel was appointed to her post when she was 33 in 2020. The case at hand was brought by 2 women and the Health Freedom Defense Fund back in July 2021. The women, Anna Daza and Sarah Pope, sued the CDC and Joseph Biden, the POTUS, and other health officials, claiming the Administrative Procedure Act was unlawfully violated. And in my opinion, she wrote a fantastic 59-page opinion. It's logical and compelling. We'll summarize it here. So first, the judge summarizes the issue at hand. Federal law required that people wear masks in airports, trains, stations, on airplanes, buses, and most other means of transportation. And if you failed to comply, you could go to jail, be fined, but at a minimum, be removed from your seat on the bus, the train, or the plane, a form of quarantine. At the end of the day, she said the mask mandate violated the authority and the process that the CDC is required to go through for rulemaking. The process is outlined in a law called the Administrative Procedure Act. It requires the government to obey certain transparency laws and allow for the public to weigh in. How about them apples? This act was violated, among other things, which we'll get to. The judge states that certain obvious things about the virus. It continued to spread, even though the government engaged in unprecedented restrictions on freedom of movement and basic freedoms in general. So after Biden took office, he issued a mask mandate for all forms of transportation, everything they could reach, planes, trains, buses, boats, subways, and all the terminals and all the public spaces that would lead up to the terminals. This was in January and February of 2021. Now, at this time, the CDC admitted that it didn't allow for public comment. It said the issue was too urgent to allow others with other points of view to weigh in. At the same time, the CDC declared itself exempt from being guided by the APA to begin with. So back in February 2021, the CDC had laid out what they thought are acceptable masks. They said that the masks can be homemade. They can be a solid piece of material. The judge said the CDC in their mandate did not differentiate on the type of mask that's actually effective at blocking transmission. The CDC even included ride-sharing vehicles in their mandate. And any marina, seaport, subway station, bus, terminal, aircraft, trains, and any other means of transport. In other words, the CDC declared itself the de facto ruler over all those public transportation hubs. And they said that the operators, the people working in those areas, had to use a best effort approach to enforce the mask mandate, or they'd be violating the law. Now, the CDC actually has police power. And with this mask mandate, They declared themselves the sheriff, and all those employees of all those transport-related companies and organizations all across the country, all of those people were their deputies. So the two plaintiffs, Daza and Pope, have medical exemptions, and they should have been provided some grace and leniency from the airlines, but they weren't. The Health Freedom Defense Fund took up their case. That fund opposes laws that force individuals to submit to medical products, procedures, or devices against their will. So they sued Biden, the Secretary of Health, the CDC director, and the director of the CDC's Division of Global Migration and Quarantine. So to make this easier to refer to and to disclose my personal view on the matter, I'm going to call the plaintiff and the legal team the Freedom Guys. They asked for a summary judgment. This is an order that can only be given if there's no dispute to any material fact. And in that instance, it's something that you're entitled to. It's just a matter of law. But it's hard to get. You've got to be there's got to be no ambiguity. Now, in matters related to the Administrative Procedure Act, the district judge, by law, sits as the appellate tribunal. He or she has the power to rule in accordance with that law. It's a clear law designed to curb the power of unelected rulemakers. So basically, the law says if an agency, like the CDC, does not follow the Administrative Procedure Act, then the judge can step in and give relief to the plaintiff by overturning whatever that order or rule was. So, in this case, the mask mandate can be legally overturned by one federal judge at the summary judgment level if the law is perfectly clear. So the legal team for the Freedom Guys had originally also sued the President of the United States, since he is the one who had actually issued the executive order to begin with on the mask mandate. But they dropped their challenge against Biden to make it easier to win the summary judgment against the CDC. This also removed the White House as a defendant, so they had one less defendant to worry about. That didn't mean that they believed Biden was innocent. It's just a legal maneuver to streamline the case. So what this did is enabled the Freedom Guys to go after the CDC like a laser, and they went after them with 4 claims that they believed they could win. The first claim by the Freedom Guys against the CDC was that the mask mandate itself exceeds the authority of the CDC. They just don't have that authority. The CDC is supposed to only possess the explicit authority that they were given by Congress. So the CDC had claimed that they had authority under the Public Health Services Act to force people to wear masks. The CDC was using a section of the 1944 Act in its section 264. And as a subsection, it's paragraph A. Now, in that paragraph, it says that they have the power to inspect, fumigate, disinfect, sanitize, and exterminate pests, destroy animals or articles that are found to be infected. So where in there is the power to mandate masks? Their lawyers said that in the word sanitize or sanitation is where they get all of their power. Really? So the judge explains that the CDC can, in fact, apprehend or detain individuals when they're coming to the United States from another country. But they can only do that when they have a very strong good faith belief that the person has the disease. Can't just do it to everybody. The 1944 Public Health Service Act is limited to quarantining infected individuals and prohibiting the import of animals known to transmit the disease. So the judge said, as a matter of fact, prior to 2020, that this has been rarely invoked. And since 2021, the CDC has used that section of the Public Health Service Act to grant itself the power to shut down the cruise ship industry, interfere with landlords' ability to evict tenants who didn't pay their rent, and require people to wear masks. Now, this isn't the only case where the CDC has been ruled against. The CDC overstepped their authority previously. The judge refreshes our recent memory that before this case, the courts had already ruled that the CDC exceeded its authority on the shutting down of the cruise ship industry and interfering with landlords' right to conduct their business in accordance with their business model. So the judge is left with this final issue. What about mask mandates? Where in the law, in Section 264 of the 1944 Public Health Services Act, do they find their authority? Well, the CDC thinks it's in the scope of the word sanitize. Judge Mizel says that's a stretch. She goes back to respected dictionaries that were used at the time of the writing of the 1944 law, and she finds that the word for sanitation, or to sanitize, related to health, is simply to remove the filth or the element that's injurious. The notion that the CDC could argue that a mask cleans something is pretty far-fetched and not the intent of the law. Now, a mask might trap some droplets, but a mask doesn't progressively and actively sanitize anything. It doesn't clean. Yet, that really is the CDC's case. They say that the word sanitation enables them to force mask wearing. But for that to be the case, wearing a mask would have to actively destroy the virus, but it doesn't. The only thing the CDC can prove is that a properly fitted and qualified mask can prevent someone who has the virus from spreading it to others. But that isn't sanitation. And on that one word, in the 1944 Act, the CDC went about all their mandates. So how did the CDC lawyers argue that? Well, they said that the CDC does have the authority to declare mask mandates. And they did this based on that Section 264A. They claim that sanitation means the promotion of hygiene and the prevention of disease by maintaining a sanitary condition. Well, hand washing would accomplish that, but not mask wearing. You're not scrubbing away any disease by wearing a mask. The judge says a clear reading of the law determines whether the CDC or the Freedom guys are right. So which is it going to be? She disagrees with the CDC. They just don't have the authority. She lays out 3 reasons that expose that the CDC's argument that they have all this authority is pretty weak. Number 1, the CDC is stretching way beyond its normal use of the word sanitation. The context of the authority found in the law is, and I'm quoting, inspection, fumigation, disinfection, sanitation, and pest extermination. Now, these are all terms that involve identifying, isolating, and destroying the disease itself. It doesn't mean that the government has the right to go house by house and sanitize people. It means the government can clean surfaces. Another argument of this word inside of this argument is that corpus linguistics also shows that the meaning of the word is straightforward. Of the 507 results for the word sanitation from 1930 to 1944, all the way up into the writing of that law, 95% of the time it meant to clean. Now, 5% of the time it did mean to keep something clean, and that's what the CDC is grabbing for. At the time of the law, the federal government's issue of quarantine power was limited to individuals and objects that carried the disease, never to go out to the entire public and try to prevent or clean it. Number 2, sanitization or sanitation is limited to property. It's not applicable to people. When the 1944 Act refers to people, it's explicit about it. Besides, in 1944, for each of the words used in the context, they weren't contemplating doing things to people. You don't fumigate people. You fumigate a contaminated room. Section A, where the word sanitation is found, just doesn't work. The CDC is commingling things that are in the later sections where the power to retain someone who is infected does actually exist, but that's limited to a foreigner who's infected. Yet, the CDC makes a tortured argument to grab a word from Section A, which applies to objects and property, and apply it to a later section to impose the restriction on people. You just can't read the law that way. You can't pick and choose words and place them wherever you want. The CDC used this illogical, random approach to conclude that wearing a mask is a condition of passing a checkpoint for your travels. So you were prevented from free passage. You could only travel if the CDC approved of your precaution. The only problem is that's not a power granted to the CDC unless it's directed at a specific person who's infected. And then it only applies to foreigners making their way into the United States. It's certainly not a part of Section 264A where the CDC is placing all of their legal case. The CDC is arguing that it can detain you if you don't wear a mask. And they even promulgated enlisting the support of all the workers, the local government, airport employees, flight attendants, and even ride-sharing drivers to enforce the removal measures. But detention and removals, not in Section A. The CDC just makes up its authority, and it just doesn't have the power to apply to all travelers, regardless of their origin or destination, a detention or a quarantine mechanism. Not in there. If you don't wear the mask, you're going to get kicked off the plane. That's a detention mechanism. So, number 2, the law states that sanitation only applies to property and objects, not people. And finally, she shoots down the CDC's attempt to win on a concept called the Chevron deference. The CDC argues that even if they are wrong on their understanding of the law, that their interpretation should be adopted anyway, since that's the way the CDC interpreted it. Now, if that ain't circular logic, my goodness gracious sakes alive, these guys are crazy. Anyway, the judge says the statute is not ambiguous. Congress addressed what the CDC can do and what it cannot do. It cannot enact preventative measures that interfere with travel upon the entire population, not their authority. And the CDC's argument isn't even reasonable. They take a word, cut it, and paste it to another location in the law to make their case. The CDC is basically saying that they can do something far-reaching even if Congress said that they can't. But Congress, in the 1944 Act, does not give them that power. If it meant to give them that power, they would have clearly done so, says the judge, especially in a matter with vast economic and political impact. So, the CDC's argument that they should be given deference just does not hold water. In summary, the CDC was basically saying they had enormous power and enormous authority, and they said that they got that authority from a strained use of the word sanitation. They basically said that sanitation gave them the ability to apply measures for preserving and promoting public health. Now that is crazy Lane. The judge provides examples of how vast this authority could reach if the CDC did in fact have the kind of police power that it believes it possesses. Thankfully, the 1944 law does not give the CDC that vast authority and power. So, round 1 goes to the Freedom Guys. They claimed the mask mandate exceeds the CDC's authority under the Public Health Services Act, and, for the reasons we just discussed above, the judge agreed. So that alone would be the end of the mask mandate. But there's more. The second claim made by the Freedom Guys is that the mask mandate improperly invoked the good cause exception to notice and comment rulemaking. In other words, anytime an agency like the CDC makes a rule, they have to let the public weigh in. That makes sense. The public includes whatever experts the public wants to bring to the table. They're supposed to be given an open forum whereby they can make comments, make arguments against it, submit written data. All this must go into the public record on the rule before the rule becomes legally binding. It's actually a requirement of the Administrative Procedure Act. The CDC should have published a notice and given a normal period of time for the public to have their say. The judge informs us that the Administrative Procedure Act is designed to give the public a chance to criticize the potential action before that action's embedded in our society. The notice and comment period is also designed to provide a mechanism to constrain the exercise of legislative power. It attempts to insert some accountability to the otherwise unaccountable rulemaking process. The CDC said it was too urgent of a matter to give the public their say. Man, they're arrogant. But the CDC failed to articulate their reasoning, and they failed to connect their reasoning to a finding in fact. They had no good cause. They just ran rampant, including establishing fines and penalties for non-mask wearers. And this was not a harmless error. The CDC knew what they were doing. They apparently didn't want to allow the public to make their arguments, and they apparently did not want to be responsible to post on their website the comments and the arguments. Now, in my opinion, it's not the judge, but in my opinion, the CDC did not want the numerous studies from around the world that claimed mask wearing was not effective. They didn't want the well-respected doctors and health institutions' findings to be recorded. But hey, that's just me. Back to the judge's ruling. The whole point of notice and comment is to provide balance and rein in an agency like the CDC. The CDC clearly did not comply with the requirement for notice and comment. So, round 2 goes to the Freedom Guys. Since the notice and comment was not complied with, and case law shows that when that fundamental violation is made by an agency, that the rule of the agency should be terminated. That's the law. The judge, for this claim alone, sets aside the mask mandate. So far, we've got 2 claims by the Freedom Guys, and they've won both. The CDC did not have the authority to issue the mask mandate, and the CDC violated the notice and comment period, and that's just provable. But there's more. The third claim by the Freedom Guys was that the mask mandate is arbitrary and capricious because the CDC failed to adequately explain their rationale. The judge agreed that the CDC did not adequately explain its reasons for the mask mandate. The CDC didn't explain why a cloth mask was useful, for example. The CDC didn't explain why temperature checks and testing was not worthwhile or sufficient. They didn't explain why occupancy limits would not be effective. In fact, the mask mandate provides no explanation for the CDC's choices at all. The law does not require the CDC to evaluate every alternative known to man, but it does require that it consider and explain its rejection of reasonably obvious and viable alternatives. The judge says that rather than explain why those alternatives were not effective, the CDC was mired in inconsistent thought and behavior. It said that, for example, that universal masking reduces transmission, but it allowed exceptions for eating, drinking, or taking medication. This should have been explained. It allowed mask exclusions for children under the age of 2. That's not masking entirely. So on the one hand, they say that only universal masking is effective, and on the other, they give no explanation for this exception. The claim is that they're being arbitrary. Arbitrary is synonymous with illogical, haphazard, and random. They just don't explain why a 2-year-old is less likely to transmit the disease than a 62-year-old. That's arbitrary. They simply made their directives, but did not comply with the requirement to explain themselves. In fact, there's no rational connection between the facts that were discovered and the choices that the CDC made. The judge explains that even if you agree that the CDC should be given deference on these matters because of their experience, it still must provide solid rationale on why it found its decision persuasive. It still must explain what their experience is on the issue and how that knowledge informed the decision. And the judge says the CDC did not do that. It did not explain why a 2-year-old got an exception and a 3-year-old did not. That's arbitrary and capricious. No study, no science, no explanation at all, just a cutoff. Somehow automatically, between 2 and 3 years of age, you don't need a mask. Capricious also means unpredictable, erratic, or unreliable. The point of the law is that by allowing public debate to inform the agency and by properly explaining the CDC's case, the CDC could make the rule trustworthy, reliable. The law requires that the agency, and in this case that's the CDC, explain why it acted the way that it did. So the judge goes on to explain why a solid rational explanation for a rule is the law of the land. When an agency, like the CDC, gets sued, in order for the rule to hold up, whatever that rule is, it has to be able to explain enough detail to the reviewing court that the court can determine that the government agency used its discretion appropriately. It's a protection mechanism for rules to be fair. Rules are, after all, put in place by people who are not elected. If a rule is put in place properly, the court can look at all their justifications on the alternative approaches to the rule, and they can make their case. But the CDC, according to the judge, didn't even try to explain. The judge ruled that since the CDC did not link the facts to their decisions, the decision is arbitrary and capricious. So, the mask mandate is set aside and gets remanded, or that means to be sent back to the CDC. So round 3 goes to the Freedom Guys. The mask mandate is proven to be without authority, round 1, without proper notice or comment, round 2, and now, round 3, it's objectively shown to be arbitrary and capricious. Could there be more? Yes. The final claim by the Freedom Guys is that the mask mandate should be vacated for violating the Administrative Procedure Act. It's a clear law, and we know what it says. The CDC tried to argue that even if the mask mandate is ruled unlawful, they knew they were on weak ground here, that it only applied to Anna Daza and Sarah Pope and the members of the Health Freedom Defense Fund. But the Administrative Procedure Act requires that the courts hold unlawful and set aside agency action if they violate the APA or if they exceed the agency's authority for everyone. The courts have a long history of authorizing that the whole rule be thrown out if either of those two violations occur. It doesn't just apply to the two people who had the fortitude to levy a lawsuit or to the members of the defense fund who took it on. It applies to everyone else who's impacted by the unlawful rule. Besides, the judge goes on and explains, how would you know if you're a ride-sharing driver that the plaintiff is legit? Everybody just comes into the ride and says, hey, I'm coming into the car and I'm not wearing a mask. I'm Sarah Pope and I don't have to wear a mask. So the judge shows how ridiculous it would be to just overturn the national rule for two people or for two people plus the members of the defense fund. No, universal relief from the rule is the only fair remedy. And the case law is pretty clear on that, especially when the plaintiffs are from all over the place, which is the case of the aggregated freedom guys. Plain and simple, if you violate the Administrative Procedure Act, the appropriate remedy is vacatur, or nullification of the rule. There are abundant examples of other rules being thrown out in totality for violating the Administrative Procedure Act. And for the same violations the CDC committed, both for the lack of notice and comment and failure to comply with statutory requirements, the CDC just bulldozed right past those. So, complete nullification of the rule is the appropriate remedy for the plaintiff's injury. Boom! Round 4 goes to the freedom guys. The order was applicable to the country, so when the mask mandate was smacked down by a federal judge, it applies to the whole US of A. The CDC exceeded their authority. The CDC did not allow for proper notice and comment. The CDC did not properly explain its decisions. The CDC acted unlawfully. Bada boom, bada bang. So, it's ordered April 18th, 2022. Kathryn Mizel, United States District Judge. So the freedom guys had a really good day, but the CDC should have had a more humble view of their role to begin with. They should have encouraged and openly discussed alternative views. Let those ruminate. They should have made the comment and notice period a transparent discovery time. They should have never violated the law. They should never have had a national mask mandate. But thank God, there are still rules and some legal thought in place that provide some safeguards. And thank God for a judge who thinks clearly. To your freedom, God bless.
Hi, I'm David Farah. Thank you for listening to my dad's podcast, The Barry Farah Show, Culture Shift. Click subscribe now to be sure you don't miss an episode. Share this podcast with your friends on social media and give The Barry Farah Show your 5-star rating. See you next time.